Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic. Chapter 4, Bound for New York. On the morning of April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic set sail for the English city of Southampton. Patrick stood beside Ranger on the deck as Belfast grew smaller in the distance. "We're off to New York, dog," Patrick said, scratching Ranger behind the ear. "We will be soon at least. First, we'll go to England and France to pick up passengers. Then back to Ireland for one last stop in Queenstown. A little over a week from now, we'll be setting off across the Atlantic." "Murphy," called one of the crewmen, "let's go. There's painting yet to do." Ranger followed Patrick down some stairs and through a long hallway to a propped open door. Inside was a fancy bed, desk, and chairs. It smelled of polished wood and fresh paint. "You'd better wait here," Patrick told Ranger. "They won't want dogs in the first-class cabins." Ranger sat in the hallway. The big ship was full of interesting smells. Salt water and steel in the sweat of all the men still working. Also, cat? Ranger sniffed the air. Definitely cat. He followed the cat smell down the hallway to a storage closet where a mother cat and her new kittens were curled up next to a crate of potatoes. Ranger barked. The cat hissed at him. Patrick appeared in the doorway. "I see you've met Jenny," he said, and reached down to stroke the cat's fur. She purred and leaned into Patrick's hand. "She's our ship's cat." Patrick stood up and patted Ranger's head, too. "Don't worry," he whispered. "The kittens may be cute, but you're still my favorite." 2 days later, the Titanic arrived in Southampton to a flurry of activity. Ranger kept an eye on Patrick, but mostly he tried to stay out of the way while workers loaded supplies. Then came the passengers. A stream of men and women in dark, fancy clothes. Some of them brought dogs. They were mostly fluffy little things, but one tall man with a mustache boarded with an Airedale he called Kitty. Ranger also saw a wrinkly dog with a scrunched up face. "I picked him up in Paris," the dog's owner told another man. "French bulldogs are popular there." Patrick carried luggage for wealthy first-class passengers who had purchased expensive tickets, with fancy rooms and fine dining. He directed third-class people where to go, too. Their tickets cost much less, so their cabins were simpler, more crowded, and on the lower decks. The night before they left Southampton, Ranger saw the Jenny cat again. She was carrying her kittens off the ship one by one. It looked like only the dogs would be going to New York. That was fine with Ranger. He didn't like being hissed at anyway. When the Titanic left England, crowds stood in the sunshine waving handkerchiefs to say goodbye. It was 4 hours to Cherbourg, France, where the ship dropped anchor a mile offshore. Cherbourg's pier wasn't big enough for the Titanic, so another boat called the Nomadic had to ferry new passengers out to board the big ship. Many of these new passengers spoke different languages. Some came from villages in Lebanon, another crew member told Patrick. They were going to start new lives in America. At the edge of the crowd, Ranger saw 2 children who looked a little older than Luke and Sadie. The girl held a small rag doll with black hair like hers. They seemed as if they might be lost. Ranger trotted over and nuzzled the boy's hand. The boy jumped back, but his younger sister knelt and stroked Ranger's fur. Soon Patrick hurried over. "What's your family?" "Where's your family?" he asked the children. "They're in America," the boy said in a small voice. "They left us behind until they could find jobs and a place to live." "Oh, are you from one of the villages in Lebanon?" Patrick asked. The girl nodded. "Our uncle taught us English," she said to to be ready for America. Teta learned too. Teta? Patrick looked around. Our grandmother, the girl said. But she is sick right now, so we are going to America on our own. She will come later. The girl seemed fine with that, but her brother's face was full of worry. Patrick understood what it was like to feel alone. But don't worry, he said. We'll take good care of you on the Titanic. What are your names? Miriam, the girl said. I'm 9, and my brother, Hammond, is 10. I'm Patrick, and I'm part of the crew. I also helped build the ship. Patrick couldn't help standing a little taller when he said that. Can you show us where our cabin is? Hammond said, holding out their tickets. Sure, but it'll have to be a little while when things quiet down, Patrick said. You're on E deck, and I'm assigned to work up here while people board. The children waited with Patrick as the other passengers boarded. When everyone was finally settled, Patrick said, Let's find your cabin now, all right? Patrick and Ranger led the children down to the Titanic E-deck, 2 floors above the ship's engine and boiler rooms. Hammond and Miriam were in a cabin with a family of 6 people from their village. The man and woman welcomed them. This crowded room looked nothing like the first-class cabins. It was smaller and simpler and filled with noise and activity. The mother was unpacking things she'd brought from home. One of the older brothers began playing a hand drum he held under his arm. Adurpaka, Miriam said, and ran over to play with him. Have a good voyage, Patrick said. You too, Miriam called. Hammond waved from his bunk. Patrick walked down a long hall to the cabin he shared with other crew members. Just one more stop before we set off across the Atlantic, dog, Patrick said, yawning. He climbed into his bunk and went to sleep with Ranger curled up at his feet. The next day, when the ship docked in Queenstown, peddlers came on board to sell Irish lace and other last-minute goods. Then, finally, the Titanic left Ireland with hundreds of seagulls flying in its wake. We're off to New York, Patrick told Ranger. Ranger sniffed the salty air and leaned in to let Patrick pet him. He'd been away from Luke and Sadie for far so long. Maybe now his work was almost done. How far was it to New York? Ranger didn't know, but he hoped that when they arrived, he'd finally get to go home.